Welcome to Acts number 13 and number 7. We're going to look at Acts 24. We continue to tell the story of Paul's experience as a Christian. Thankfully, our experiences today are not quite so confrontational in Australia, but let's remember that for many around our world, it actually is a little bit like this. So let's read on in verse 1. After 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and a spokesman, one named Tertullus. He laid before the governor their case against Paul. Okay, here we have a scenario statement. The Jews go to the Romans with the case of blasphemy. Now that's a bit weird, but this is a narrative of the event, and we realise the narrative is telling us that there is a bending of the rules. And here we go, verse 2. And when he had been summoned, Tertullus began accusing him, saying, "Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation. In every way and in everywhere we accept this with all gratitude." Basically, this is just one big suck up. Softening the guy up so we can get Felix on their side. And it goes on. Verse 4. "But to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness, hear us briefly. For we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes." Okay, throughout the world, Paul did seem to have an effect or an impact wherever he went. And sometimes, yes, that was riotous. So it's not an unfair statement, but he's trying to push blame onto him, isn't he? Verse 6 goes on, "He tried to profane the temple, but we seized him." The interesting thing is, profaning the temple is a Jewish law, so he hands him over to the Roman authorities. That's weird, isn't it? Verse 8 goes on and says, "By examining him yourself, we will be able to find out from him about everything which we accused him." Basically here they're saying, we're giving him to you. It's now in your court. You can make the decision. And they're just going to join along. It goes on. "The Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so." So the Jewish crowd seems to be liking to join in. They did it with Jesus, didn't they? They did it with Stephen, and they've done it with Paul numerous times. The governor Felix doesn't make a big deal of it. He just nods. Here he goes. When the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul replied, notice that, just nods. Yeah, off you go. So Paul speaks. "Knowing that for many years you have been judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defence." Paul starts, and remember that he starts in a format. The speaking, debating and legal speak of the day was Greek rhetoric, and Paul gives his speech in that correct form. So as we go through this whole speech, we will find that he follows the rules of debating of the time. Verse 11 goes on, it says, "You can verify that this is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem." Notice basically there he's saying, you can check that out. Verse 12 goes on, it says, "They did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city." In other words, he's saying to Felix, you check it out. What they say is not the case. Yeah. Goes on in verse 13. "Neither can they prove to you what they now bring against me." Now, here's something significant. Proof is something that Roman and Greek legal systems find basically primary. They call for proof, eyewitnesses, and checking of the facts. Now, he starts his apologetic of his belief system. He defends himself, or more correctly, he lays out what it is that he's going to say in an appropriate format to his audience. Verse 14, "But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship God, the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God that these men themselves accept that there will be a resurrection of both the just and unjust." He connects his faith system with theirs. In other words, he starts on a common ground. And this is a huge principle for us to take on board when we explain the Jesus message to people. He goes further. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. In other words, he's saying, I work really hard at being a good bloke, according to the rules. He states that he works hard to stay within the regulations of his and the Jews' religion. He points out why he was in the region, particularly in Jerusalem, in the next couple of verses. He says, "Now, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and present offerings. While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult. But some of the Jews from Asia, they ought to be here before you and to make the accusation, should they have anything against me." As you see here, we've got the real accusers didn't show. It's now second-hand. Again, outside of Roman legal practice. Verse 20 says, "Or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council." Now this is interesting. Obviously, some of them were actually at the previous hearing in Jerusalem, yet they hadn't made accusations from that trial. Verse 21 goes on and says, "Other than this one thing that I cried out while standing among them, it is with the respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today." Here he admits in some way that he provoked an argument, particularly a political argument. You see, the Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection of the dead, but the Pharisees did, and this is the statement that causes kerfuffle with them. So what do we get out of this? And we've got to think that way with every passage. We're not just reading a book here. We're reading something that impacts us. Well, a couple of things. Paul stood his ground. He didn't take a backward step. He also, the second point is, he found common starting point. Remember? He talked about their faith and his faith. Also, Paul uses correct processes. He uses the correct legal speak. And he pointed out that others used the wrong process. Paul admits when he set up a level of confusion. So what does that tell us? Be smart and think about how we communicate Jesus. We're going to move further into it in the next weeks, and we'll look at what he said in his actual defense. Bless you.